I want to talk about the origins of the term Africa, right, or identifying as an African, because um, anyone who studied history, you understand how during the scramble of Africa, they just put people in a zone, named it a country, but a lot of these people have no s- religious, cultural, or linguistic connection, right? So, how do you view the term African?
The term African is interesting because if we look at history, Africa comes from the word Ifriqiya, which was a word that the Arabs used to describe the colony that they had in Tunisia. So it's an Arabic word originally, and it's a concept, and Africa as a continent. It's interesting because before colonization, you never see Africans referring to themselves as Africans. And you never see them referring to the place where they live or the continent that they live on as Africa, because they didn't have the concept of this continent and they didn't have this concept of being African. Everybody ascribed to their own kingdom, their own tribe, their own language, their own history, their own culture, their own identity within their regions. So if you go to, as I mentioned earlier, the Gambia, for example, we have about 7 to 8 ethnic groups there. In Nigeria, there's over 200 ethnic groups. In Ghana, here where we are, there's over 80 different ethnic groups. All of these ethnic groups, before colonization, never saw themselves as Africans or referred to themselves as Africans. But when colonization happened and they divided the world into Africa and Asia and Europe and North America and South America, this concept of Africa as a continent was then given to us on the continent. And then we had to now see ourselves as part of this new world order that has been created by Western imperialism. And then the scramble for Africa, as you mentioned, where the Europeans took this continent, which they named Africa, and then they divided it amongst themselves and drew all of these boxes and placed people who had no affiliation when it came to language, culture, history, or identity as part of one nation and made them into these different countries. And so the concept of being African now is a political reality where we know that because of the way the world works, we've all ascribed to this Westphalian concept of nation states. We all have passports which we need to travel and etc. And we've defined ourselves in terms of continents. But in reality, the concept of Africa never existed in Africa before colonization.
How does that influence the idea of African unity? Because you have so many people that have a different perspective of the world and culture who are supposed to unite for a common good, but when in reality and historically, there was never much of a unification.
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult thing to try and enforce. And it's a very, very difficult dream to have because as much as people in the diaspora and people outside of Africa see Africa as one, people within Africa see themselves according to their language, their culture, their ethnicity, and their history. So for us as Africans, we need to understand Africa not as a historical reality, but as a political concept, and then work with each other in terms of forming some type of federation or forming some types of unity with regards to this new situation that we find ourselves in being Africans in the 21st century. But it's a completely new thing that has never existed before Western imperialism. So it's very, very difficult to have African unity or to have this concept of, Pan-Africanism when Africans had never seen themselves as one people before Europeans told us that we were one people. So it is difficult, but at the same time, we have to realize that it is a political reality, that there are certain policies that have been made by the powers that be and by the governments and all of the, global institutions with regards to Africa and African people. We have specific economic policies. We have specific, international monetary fund readjustment programs and all of these things that are affecting our economies, affecting our ways of travel. The African passports are some of the weakest passports in the world. The political situation and the actual reality that we live in as Africans due to this status that has been given to us should force us to unite and form solutions in terms of Pan-African trade and in terms of Pan-African governmental institutions and cooperation between African nations in order to be able to strengthen ourselves with regards to the global economy and with regards to the global political system that we find ourselves in. But it's hard because it's something that never existed before.
And people in the West who identify as Africans, I clearly understand why, because you don't know the origins from which you came. So
Exactly.
you just got to connect to the continent.
You just say you
know what I'm
connect to the
saying?
continent.
So you
But
just
what I find interesting and I find funny as well is when people say, for example, North African Arabs are not African, or East Africans are not real Africans, or specifically with the North African thing. So I see like a lot of people, when they see North Africans, who a lot of them are from Western lineage and a lot of them are from Arab lineage, and they're not indigenous to the African continent. But the fact that they migrated to the African continent and they live there on the continent makes them just as African as me. And this whole concept of these people are real Africans and these people are fake Africans is a laughable concept, because really there was no such thing as Africa before the West invented the concept of Africa. So that's something that I find extremely interesting. So I have a friend, for example, I'm from Senegambia, right? Senegal-Gambia region on my mother's side. And right next to us is a country called Mauritania. And Mauritania has a very large Arab population, a very large Amazigh Berber population, as well as having indigenous African tribes and ethnicities there. So I have a friend in Mauritania who did the 23andMe DNA test, and their result came back that they were over 20% Iberian, which is Spanish and Portuguese. And we know because of the relationship between the Moors in Spain and the migration, and then when Isabel and Ferdinand kicked all of the Moors out of Spain and they had to move back to Africa, there was a large migration of people. But by that time, intermixing had already been happening to the point that my friend in Mauritania, whose ancestry probably comes from North Africa and then into Mauritania, which is in West Africa, has Spanish and Portuguese DNA. So all of these things, you know, but when it comes to nationality and when it comes to living on the continent, that person is just as African as I am, because they have a West African passport, I have a West African passport. But in terms of history, culture, ethnicity, my mother's side, I'm Creole and Wolof. Their side, they're Arab and whatever. And then when you look further into the DNA, you see even more history and more stories. But I don't think that either one of us, that takes away from our Africanness. And that's something that we also need to think about, that we can't exclude certain people from being African when Africa is a concept that was invented by the West.